We're going to start off with Kieran and a presentation about using 5G for onboard racing car video. Kieran.
Thanks, Brad. It's good to be back in Marina del Rey. So yes, I'm going to be talking about 5G for onboard racing car video. So who are we? I always do this slide. Open Broadcast Systems, what do we do? We're a company specializing in software-based encoders for sports, news, and channel contribution, and this is business to business. And we're based in central London, so for the last 2 years, I've been pointing to my left, going, this is Big Ben over there. We build everything in-house, hardware, firmware, software, every single line of code. We're not to be confused with the other OBS, the web streaming solution. So a quick introduction to onboard racing video. As many of you know, there's the racing leagues that we're all aware of, Formula One, NASCAR, etc. IndyCar, sorry. Yeah, there's always going to be one. Ranging, I would say, from professional to what's known as sort of semi-professional. Many of them are actually very niche. And realistically, some of these niche leagues are basically hobbies for people with large wallets. Historically, what have been known as gentleman racers. Obviously, that's a bit different now, lots of female racers. But they do race at world-class racing tracks, Le Mans, Spa, etc. So historically, onboard video, that's first used in the 1980s in Formula One. It's, as a viewer, obviously one of the most exciting and dramatic parts of a race, being able to be on board the actual car. But all of this at the moment today uses private radio frequency links, licensed frequencies, very specialist encoders, antennas, repeaters, and then really only the highest of high-end leagues can afford this. These licensed frequencies require a lot of paperwork, depending where they are in the world, different languages, different regulations. You've got to have RF engineers on site to make sure they're complying with all these regulations. It's very complex at the moment. And there are a number of reasons for onboard video. The obvious one that we hear the obvious one is broadcast television. But also the teams are really interested in this video if the regulations allow it. So in that case, as you see above, the multi-view is generated in the car itself. So you get all three feeds on the same screen, as opposed to broadcast where they cut between them. And that's important because I'll talk about it later. Don't underestimate the need for rich people to show off to their friends and family that they're playing race car driver at the weekend. That's a substantial commercial driver for all of this. And team morale, I forgot to say team strategy. I'd say strategy and operations. For example, during the race I went to, we saw from the onboard feed that one of the seat belts was loose, one of the harnesses was a little bit loose, and that was something they could fix during a pit stop, and that was, that gave them actual literal value to the team themselves. Team morale, it's actually really good for team morale. Often at these racing things, the drivers talk to themselves, the strategists stay amongst themselves, the mechanics talk to themselves, and it really helps bond the team together. And I must admit, this was during a period where the car on the left, which was actually the 4G car, was battling quite fiercely with the car in front of it, so for position 1 and position 2, and it was very dramatic to see the overtakes and see the team react, and it certainly added a lot of value for the team itself. So it's not just about broadcast television, really. So cellular video solutions, so I talked quite a bit about this in the fall 2021 series presentation with Nematon TV about experiences with weekly sports broadcasts over 5G and what's possible and what isn't yet. That goes into a lot more detail about frequency bands, MIMO, all of this 5G stuff. I haven't got time to go and repeat that, but I'll cover this just as an introductory slide. As many of you know, over the last 10 years, especially in news gathering, cellular bonded solutions have become very prevalent for news gathering, talking heads, and there is some use in sport at the moment. I would say mainly web, but changing market. This is, generally speaking, a single vendor walled garden solution, Apple-style environment. Vendor X can only talk to vendor X. And these, generally speaking, use adaptive bitrate solutions. So if you're in a crowd, there's congestion, they will drastically drop the bitrate, and it can be quite aggressive. But for news in particular, it allows camera operators who don't really understand anything about IP video to get pictures back to base, and they're kind of good enough. I think personally, I find it a bit unfortunate that 4G isn't used for more higher-end applications because people, unfortunately, conflate the implementation of 4G. So they assume that all pictures need to be cellular backpack quality. And I think their perception is kind of skewed. And I'll talk about this a bit more. And the second presenter in the fall 2021 presentation explained how they put the same data stream that they put on satellite over a bonded 4G connection at quite busy venues without major issues, and if there's 5G available, they'll use 5G. So it's a bit unfortunate that perceptions are skewed by backpacks, but 5G lets us rewrite the slate. So why use 5G cellular for racing? So, well, at many racetracks around the world, there's a very large rollout of 5G towers. The track on the right is Le Mans. The French government is actually really helpful in that they publish very detailed information about where all the towers are, how high they are, what directions they they transmit in, and what frequency bands they use. So it's really helpful for us in this case. You get very low pings over 5G, 10 to 20 milliseconds, and you get high bandwidth, I think up to 100 megabits. This is kind of comparable to private RF. Private RF, I think, is 100 milliseconds end to end, and I think, as I'll talk about later, the goal we want to try and get to is 150, 200, which isn't bad. And in many cases outweighs the complexity of having RF engineers, licensing, paperwork, all the complexity around that. Somebody mentioned yesterday also RF in many countries is full, the private RF frequencies, so being able to use public, and I'll talk about later, private 5G for that is a benefit. So as I mentioned, the benefits of radio frequency without costs, rigging, licenses, etc. In the future, it will be obviously important to get other data, telemetry, control data, and that's much easier over IP than it is using traditional RF solutions. But I think most importantly for the company, we have sat at home for the last 2 years. It's good to get about, it's good to be doing exciting things like racing. So yes, cell towers are being installed very rapidly. During the test in Le Mans 6 weeks ago, we literally used the tower turned on a week before. More towers were turned on the week after, a couple of weeks after. This world moves very, very quickly. You can see how tall the towers are. You can use Google Maps to see if you get line of sight. It's a very fast-moving world. In fact, I think the second draft of this slide, more towers were added. So it moves very, very quickly. But there are some obviously quite challenging technical challenges. Encoding is obviously the big one, and I'll talk quite in detail about this. Most of the portable solutions are based around battery backpacks. They're designed to be portable. They're designed to reduce battery life. And most of them have, broadly speaking, consumer-grade encoders. And I'm not trying to belittle consumer-grade encoders. Solving encoding at 2 watts is a major engineering achievement. But the challenges of racing, and that I'll talk about in a minute, mean that they do struggle. So this is one of the backpacks and the chip it uses. It's the Umbrella. It's a major technical achievement to be at 2 watts, but it's the kind of thing used in GoPros, DJI drones, and the fast motion of racing. And if a multi-view is used, the fact that you've now got 3 quadrants or even more really does cause a lot of issues. And unfortunately, this room might understand that, but most of the world thinks it's a cellular technology causing this, but it's not. It's the implementation of said cellular technology. Adaptive bitrate also causes a lot of challenges, so the team in question did try all the backpacks. And unfortunately, there are the odd dead spots on the track. And what these adaptive bitrate solutions do is rapidly drop down at the dead spot. It takes about half a lap to come back, so the picture just goes to mush. Gradually comes back, and coming back is a difficult technical problem, actually, knowing when to ramp. As the car goes round, goes past the same place again, glitches again. So in practice, only half the race is viewable, and that's unfortunately one of the challenges. And what you really want, and this is what we try to achieve, is you just want a momentary glitch, as you see in Formula 1 or others, that's very momentary, and you have to actually kind of know what to look for sometimes, because the error concealment in a decoder are often very, very good. And then you want it just to continue. You kind of want CBR. You don't really want adaptive bitrate. In comparison to journalism or other things where you want to hear and listen to the journalists, irrespective of whether they're in a war zone, a crowd, etc. Some of the backpack solutions also assume the camera operator's there and the mechanics aren't particularly happy, or drivers are particularly happy pressing start, stop, trying to configure this thing. They've got other issues to deal with during the race. The batteries also cause operational issues. The vehicle is obviously moving at 100 to 200 miles an hour. There's vibrations, there's heat. You'll see downstairs on the booth the kind of crazy vibrations that the car was going through. Dirty 12-volt power supply, also a challenge. But there's one thing that's very interesting is racing is a field which is technically aware, and it really does appreciate the need for technology. Many of you have sat in a bar with me where I've ranted about drowning in the sea of mediocrity, people saying, why do we need 2110 when we have NDI? These kind of things. Why do we need wrist when we have SRT. And the thing that was interesting at racing, there was an appreciation by everybody of the technological progress that was going on. I had engine specialists asking questions, looking at, like, oh, the picture quality of this one, now that's 5G, is better, the delay is lower, drivers, mechanics, like, and that's really interesting because there's an appreciation of how technology can benefit them as a team and to win a race, and that was really interesting. So Renault talked about miniaturization. On the left is kind of what we do day to day, and what's incredible is something like this 3 years ago now fits in the palm of your hand and has more processing power. It's quite remarkable. And what's interesting is you can do like pretty decent encoding, large motion search space, small, low power. It can be powered by a dirty 12-volt power source. Operationally, it's much more efficient because the traditional RF solutions are so valuable, they have to take them out of the cars and rig them before every race and de-rig them and take them somewhere else because they're worth so much. The NUC, you could just leave it in the car. Like, if it's damaged in a crash, you just get another one. It's not that big a deal in many respects. So this actually was the NUC that was in the car. There's a part shortage. I don't have any spare NUCs, so I had to take it out of the car. 5G modem. So the previous presentation goes into a lot more detail about this, but it's worth talking about this still because it's one of the challenges. These things are often based off consumer chipsets, so Qualcomm, Huawei, MediaTek, Samsung, often regional specific versions, and relatively immature technology. In particular, we're not really using these modems like a consumer would. We're sending constant UDP traffic for up to 24, 25, long durations, and they can, without ventilation, get very hot. They draw a lot of power, certainly instantaneous power. They're right at the end of what's possible in USB 3. So in the early prototypes that I'll show, we didn't use extension leads, we didn't have the right parts, they didn't arrive on time. And there's many variants with different behavior, so one that works well, funnily enough, the one that works perfectly in the US says it supports Europe, doesn't work in Europe. The one that works in Europe sometimes doesn't work under certain cases, and it's quite complex, and my colleague Matt, you can talk to him about that. So the simplest answer to try and debug all of these things is literally to plug it into your phone, and I must say, superstitiously, sometimes a phone can just magically fix things. I don't believe in superstition, but I have spent hours on end trying to fix a problem, take the SIM card out, put it in a phone, put it back in, fixes all the problems. So SIM cards and data plans on public networks are arguably more complicated than the technology themselves. Very complex to buy SIMs and data plans. Oddly enough, the UK is really easy for this. I don't fully understand why, but you can buy as much. You can buy unlimited data plans. They are very low cost. In France, it was very complicated. You needed local ID cards, their equivalent of social security numbers, addresses. Some of the operators require you to sign up to contracts, and if you don't live there, that's not going to happen. The USA, having tried it earlier in the week, is also quite challenging. There are plans where the mobile operators detect traffic and they throttle you. There are also plans where they want you to use a certified device. In the cellular bonding world, most of the international, there is a solution to this, is to use B2B international plans, which are wholesale, but the vast majority of those are 4G. However, since the race, even 6 weeks ago, it's quite a fast-moving marketplace. So a few of these operators now have, B2B providers have international roaming 5G SIMs, but at the moment they seem to be substantially more expensive than domestic options. I think that's going to become an issue. It's certainly very difficult to buy more than 100 gigabytes of data. The mechanics are not happy if you want to do a SIM card change during a pit stop. This is a very fiddly thing. They are not happy. And with 5G, the data rates are so fast, if you make a mistake, you could really just cause yourself a massive bill. You have to be really careful with the plan that you order, make sure it's not got overage charges, etc. Because some of these cars will go around, they're very long endurance races, they'll go around. There are ways of stopping the data, and I can explain maybe afterwards, but if you get this wrong, you could have a big bill, basically. And especially in the international B2B plans, the overage fees are very expensive. Some things to think about. Beware fake 5G. The 5G logo means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, unfortunately. And so this is how most devices operate. If the tower is capable of 5G, so your device interrogates the 4G layer at the moment, but your modem it doesn't support the 5G band, you will still get a 5G logo. If the tower is capable of 5G, again, but the 5G layer doesn't have coverage over you, so the 4G layer of the tower, maybe at a different frequency to the 5G, the 4G layer can reach you, but the 5G can't, you'll still get a logo. And there's something known as dynamic spectrum sharing, so that's where they use the same spectrum to mix 4G layers and 5G layers. I'm told, again, by our colleagues at Nematon, I haven't seen this much in the UK because it's mostly in the countryside, but uploads are reportedly better, downloads are the same, but the logo is still shown. This is one form of fake 5G. The tower actually has to decide to give you 5G. So what's interesting is in Europe, you start uploading traffic, you'll basically always be promoted to 5G. What I've noticed in the US is you can start uploading and you won't be promoted to 5G just yet. You have to actually start artificially creating some download traffic, even if you're not using it, and then the US operators will update, well, the tower will update you to actually give you 5G traffic. Even if if the tower hasn't upgraded you yet, you will still get a 5G logo. And the only real way to understand what's going on is to use AT commands from 1981 to go and figure out like what's actually happening. In 2022, we're still using Hayes AT commands to debug, gigabits of traffic. And so lots of talk, at various forums about private, non-public 5G networks, mainly around industrial applications, so robotics, CCTV, logistics, VR. In Europe, this is a bit challenging because of spectrum issues, but in the US, you have something known as citizen band radio service. So there is a chunk of spectrum that's allocated and regulated relatively lightly for these kind of applications. So that could be very interesting. Certainly okay for a broadcaster to cover something like a stadium with one, maybe two towers, but a track is much more complicated for coverage, arguably as complex for RF. So one of the ideas that could be possible in the future is the racetrack could offer this as a service, so it could use ticketing. You could have a private 5G network around the track, lots of towers, for ticketing, CCTV, and then the race car traffic would just be another high priority traffic segment on this network. But obviously it's quite complex to operate a 5G network. The jargon in 5G, I thought 2110 jargon was bad. 5G jargon, 2 orders of magnitude worse. It's complex. You've seen in the news, it's nation-state levels of complexity, right? Like, it's 5G. So let's do it for real at 120 miles an hour. The goal really was to have some kind of latency at broadly 100 to 200 milliseconds glass to glass. Initially, this just started as a static rig with the NUC standing in one place. We have good coverage in our office. That's where we kind of worked through all the power challenges. It was quite frustrating for weeks and weeks on end understanding this combination of this versus this until we had something that kind of worked. We decided to use Zixi and AWS Media Connect. There are others available, and I'll talk about that later, mainly because it has inbuilt bonding. Bonding is a topic for later as well, because there's an interesting pro and con in 5G. And I forgot to mention, since data in the UK is essentially unlimited, you have different incentives on the way you use data, because I could just blast out all my traffic 3 times, right? I have no limits. It's quite an interesting way of looking at things. But yeah, Zixi has tight integration with the modems, so like if the modems crash, Zixi will handle the reconfiguration of the routes. And at these sort of latencies, we're kind of going to be doing FEC. We're not really going to be doing retransmissions in the end. The odd retransmission was attempted. The odd one might get through. So what happened is my colleague put an encoder in his car and drove around London, obviously not at 120 miles an hour. And it's a bit different to the track. He has very large buildings which occlude things. And basically, I sat in the office, logged into the car, changed latency settings, see how things reacted. I will refrain from showing some of the more entertaining parts of that video, such as driving down the wrong way down a one-way street. But funny and entertaining, minor traffic violations. So this is how we tested latency on the static rig, obviously classic timecode source. We used a decoder on the LAN that took 7 frames. We didn't try to actually tune the decoder yet, so we just used the actual product that we shipped. So we could actually cut another 3 or 4 frames, but the product we actually ship has to be quite resilient to third-party streams, which might not have compliant transport streams. So if we knew beforehand that it's coming from us or it's coming from a compliant source, we could probably cut another three or four frames off. And then we could see the 5G decode is another, what is it, 6 frames behind. So say 7 plus 6 is 13, yep. So 200 milliseconds end to end, 100 milliseconds encode decode delay at 1080p 5994, I think 16 times 7, or roughly, and then 100 milliseconds 60 delay. And that was pretty stable, apart from a few things I'll talk about afterwards. And actually, it's a bit, I've changed it now so the 5G is at the bottom, so you look more logically. So you see source, LAN, and 5G. But you can see where all the latency is accumulated. You can see which ones are glitching, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, let's do it for real. I had major trouble getting SIM cards in France. I had to go to a store, use a vending machine, try and explain what I'm trying to do. For one operator, there just was no other way to buy it. We did obtain one other SIM card via a B2B provider at considerable expense, and it turned out to be one of the fake 5G modes. And actually, I didn't quite understand at the time because the modem was saying there was some sort of 5G, but the AT messages were quite confusing in that it kind of saw something there, but it wasn't capable of supporting that band that they were using on. At the time, we had power issues, so the modems had to go straight into the encoder. That's changed a bit recently. We didn't have the right parts to try and do voltage injection. It's quite inflexible. It was a bit of a messy rig. So at the bottom, you've got the multi-viewer. So that takes in the cameras, generates the mosaic. The middle, you've got the NUC-based encoder. And at the top, you've got an audio embedder. It's surprisingly disconcerting to watch onboard video without engine noise. It's very strange. It just looks really weird. So hearing the vroom vroom of the engine actually is, yeah, an important part. The mechanics took this messy rig, and they took the safety element of this very seriously. It was taped, it was cable tied multiple times over, mainly because they were scared something would fly off, get stuck under the brake panel, and it's disastrous. This was taken really seriously. New iterations that we're building, we'd like to mount the antennas a bit more on the roof or in a different place, because as you'll see, it's not at all in the best of places. So it's directly behind the driver in like this A-frame. There's obviously like a giant chunk of water, so signal integrity. So in principle, we could mount them up here and up here, which is what they do for the 4G side of things. So the intention was to use 3G SDI, but we had some issue with payload ID that I didn't want to be debugging payload ID in a freezing cold garage while sitting inside, like trying to, try and contort to fit behind this car. So in the end, I gave in and used 1080i with higher latency. I guess we could have taken one of the cameras and plugged it in directly and maybe avoided the payload ID issue, but yeah, it is what it is. So there was some time to do free practice and have testing. The team wouldn't let us use one of the cars that was in the running to actually win the race, so we ended up using one of the, let's just say, ones bringing up the rear. And initially, we set the latency to, that should say the Zixi latency to 100 milliseconds, and the bitrate to 10. These were just numbers kind of made out of the sky. And then we saw that after a lot of confusion, we discovered this whole thing about fake 5G, WhatsApping people going, why is the modem thinking it has 5G, but it doesn't quite have 5G? So all of the frequency bands it was showing, for example, all the signal strength was just 65355 or whatever, like the error code is. So in the end, we ended up using one operator, and actually on the map, we ended up using the farthest possible operator, but their tower was quite tall, so we had kind of pros and cons. They only had one tower on the track, but the tower was very tall. So. And in the end, we increased the Dixie latency to 200 milliseconds, which gave us 450 overall, so we had to compromise. We had to go from 100 milliseconds end-to-end on video to 200 milliseconds end-to-end, or 250 when you add up the differences between PAL and NTSC. And then, so that was a bit unfortunate. We did also have the main reason for that was jitter bursts. So I talk about that in the VSF4 presentation, and I'll talk about that a bit afterwards. Basically, most of the time it's very, very stable. You have, 15, 20 milliseconds ping and round trip times and 20 milliseconds jitter. But you do get big bursts, and I'll talk about them later. So the buffer's not really there to do retransmissions or anything. It's there just to ride out these bursts. And the team, unfortunately, just started using it, so there wasn't really that many more chance to do testing. It was pretty stable for 3 days. The car had some power issues of its own that affected things, but nothing major. So I guess I can't really see on the screen because it's quite low resolution, but the idea, I guess, is to have, although this is a static shot, the idea is the multi-view has its issues with aliasing. This projector's also got some aliasing issues, but the road has texture, the steering wheel has texture, there's actual detail in the pictures at speed. I don't know, if it had been at 20 megabits, that would have been even nicer. H.264, by the way, but it's what it is. There is still, detail that you don't get with some of the low-power solutions or chip-based solutions, I would say. So here's an example of the kind of thing you saw on a track. What was quite interesting is you kind of could do some semi-scientific measurements in that you could make a change to the system, let the car go around the track, make another change and kind of let it go around again, and not precisely, it doesn't necessarily take the same racing line, there could be other things in the way, but you kind of overall had a good idea of what was going on. And so you can kind of see, this is just one of the runs. So unfortunately, when they stop the engine, you lose the data, so you have to be quick. And I didn't have time to write a monitoring solution that goes and polled all of this before the engine was cut off and stored it in a database, etc. So I just had to quickly grab it, quickly get a screenshot before the web page said no route found. But you can kind of see mostly FEC recoveries. I think I put quite a lot of FEC on as a test, so we were nearly, I think probably 80% FEC just to see what happened. Most FEC recoveries, all ARQ requests attempted and kind of failed. So nothing actually ever got there in time. Some recoveries, but this was, and I'll talk about this was almost always during the pit straight, just not the end of the world, and it glitched momentarily and came back. I think there's a lot more work that can be done protocol-wise, and certainly we're working with Zixi and others on specific protocols around 5G where it's salt and pepper background loss. You don't really want to be using pro-MPEG FEC in 2022, so Zixi's using Reed-Solomon. There are others. Bonding caused some issues. I'm not fully sure if that's an implementation issue or a bonding issue. I'd rather not use 2022-7. I'd rather just send more FEC because the packets, I'd rather probably not have to just receive packets I may already have. I'd rather probabilistically try and recover packets of FEC. And so I mentioned these big jitter bursts. This is not on the track, it's in the office, but it's quite hard to catch one of these and get a screenshot. But basically, you see the round trip time is pretty good, but the bell curve of packets, you just suddenly get a burst that's really, really late. And you don't, unfortunately, it's so momentary. It happens a couple of times an hour. You kind of have to do a whole hour of packet captures and do some maths. And I haven't really had the time to work with Zixi to go and figure out, well, first of all, are they doing the measurements correctly? That's one thing. I assume they are, but they may not be. Or is there a particular pattern to this, et cetera, et cetera? And I'll talk about this a bit more, but it would be good one day to understand from a 5G expert, why this happens. So, obvious elephant in the room with 5G being a shared resource on a public network. Very large crowds where there's fans in the stands and covering the outskirts is going to be challenging. But mid to lower tier events, mid-tier events, by the way, because of the fan base, still have very high quality productions with big truck rollouts, big multi-camera things. It's just sometimes the RF element is either cost or operationally not possible. So even mid-tier events that with cars going 200 miles an hour, there is still a possibility of using 5G for this. The one that is challenging is the grid lineup, because everyone's on Instagram doing their lives and taking photos and doing selfies with the cars. That is what everyone's both there and people have said who use 4G for controlling things for telemetry have said that's the one where you have nothing for a while. But to be honest, live onboard video when they're stopped like that, it's not that useful, so you might be okay in reality. The garage is a problem. It's a large concrete block. I first arrived at the garage, I did a speed test. I got 300 down and 1 up, and I thought this isn't going to happen. Obviously, RF has the same issues. It's a giant concrete block. They don't necessarily put antennas inside. But again, probably not the end of the world not to have onboard video. Pit stops, I thought they were going to be a problem, but actually pit stops, Formula One makes them interesting, but actually they're not as interesting in any other races as you might think. It's watching someone fill up a fuel tank. It's not that interesting, to be honest. So it may not be the end of the world. So yeah, these jitter bursts we think could be time division duplexing in the 5G network, or it could be some modes of 5G have some form of retransmission internally that you can't control. It could be that. Pit straight's a problem. You've got concrete on both sides, but it's the fastest part of the track. So it doesn't really matter to an extent because you'll be out of it by the time you've got some, you make very swift progress through it. So you glitch quickly and recover. Many towers, they're far away from spectators. May not be the end of the world. So this was the one we actually ended up using. So you can see how far away it is from the actual grid. So we had a glitch almost always, and you'll see in the video on the booth, almost always here, because it's almost the furthest point on the track, and is blocked off by all of these things on the side. And it was fortunate. I think this is the tallest tower and has line of sight to the majority of the track, but there's only one of them, whereas these other operators, there's other choices. Other tracks are different. They have trees, they have other occlusions. Probably, in most countries, you don't get this data, so you'd have to measure it directly. So conclusions, 5G has the possibility to really reduce the cost of onboard video probably by a factor of 10 compared to radio frequency links, and certainly simplify operations because cars don't have to be rigged and de-rigged. Like I mentioned, we're going to be testing at the Le Mans Classic, which is actually the older Le Mans racing cars, which are actually faster than the new ones. It has crowds, but it's not full to the brim. So it will be interesting to see what happens. I think it will work. It will be interesting to see what the latency trade-offs will have to deal with. The 5G SIMs, complexity of that means it's certainly not plug and play at the moment for mechanics or anyone else. Most events, they'll remain 4G. They'll turn on the car. They'll wait a bit. They'll get pictures. Sometimes they need to do work on the car, and that involves taking the encoding and cameras and all the rigging out, and they'll need to re-rig it. So they may not, the complexity of trying to do that with 5G, et cetera, at the moment, it's not great. There's not usually a video engineer on site at the time. It's a mechanic who can understand electric, so they can crimp BNCs, they can do these other things, but not necessarily go and understand the complexities of modems and SIMs, et cetera. I'd like to put them in a ton of cars, spin up a cloud multi-viewer, such as Tag. We use it in the Cerberus LiveLink platform. There are others, obviously, that exist, but I'd like to just spin up a giant multi-view for a race and then just spin it down. But overall, 5G has a bunch of technical and commercial challenges, but 5G is coming whether we like it or not. There's obviously there's a juggernaut of telecom industry, things happening around it. I think there's a substantial amount more work needed on 5G native protocols, because this is a different problem space to RIST, SRT, FEC, et cetera. And personally, I think this might need to have more protocol-specific work around 5G and the specific behavior of the networks themselves. And that is it. Questions? On the booth, we have the actual transport stream that came from the car, so you can see exactly how it behaves, although the glitching on VLC looks substantially worse than an actual professional IRD, so yeah.
All right, great, thank you. Andy, you got a question?
Hey, excellent presentation.
Thanks.
Love that. Just a couple of observations. First of all, a plug. I'm going to do something that's quite complimentary later this morning on some elements of this. But one of the things that I've discovered in my deep dive on 5G technology is there are so many layers of integrity stuff that's happening much lower down than we play with. And I think one of the things I've learned is some of our kind of application layer protection stuff actually can almost fight against some of the other mechanisms that are sitting much lower down than we experience. And
I want to add to that. So some of the 5G traffic is actually going over the 4G network. The tower decides how to do the split, and you don't know. So that burst could be the tower decided to put 10% of the traffic over the 4G network.
But even in what we call 5G standalone, which is pure 5G, there are still challenges because of the way the underlying protection mechanisms work. So I think some of the rethinking we need to do is like think about that whole stack in the way we do integrity for our application.
That was kind of what I was saying with bonding. It's like traditional bonding is not going to work. Like we had the issue that a problem on one network killed the whole thing, and it's like that shouldn't be the case. If we're doing heavy FEC and splitting that over two networks, the point of FEC is to be able to have the whole of one network fall over or drastically reduce, but not affect the other. But that just wasn't the case in practice.
Yeah, great work.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, in fact, just to build on that, when we were doing the 2022-7 stuff, we were very conscious of the sort of error profiles that were there, and also of the sort of network protection switching that occurred kind of below us. And so for these sorts of applications, it would seem if we really want to tackle this, we would definitely need to do an analysis of that stack to get it right.
And I think it's substantially more complex. Like, as I said, nation state level complexity now. This is not just like it's, yeah. So it would be good to, certainly operators have said, yeah, we could put you in touch with the right people who could explain what's going on, but we haven't got that far yet, but we'll get there.
Yeah, and I already mentioned my son is an engineer in an IndyCar, on an IndyCar team.
Okay, that's
yeah,
cool.
McLaren. And so watching the Indy 500, they had a red flag just toward the end of the race. I don't know how many people saw that, but you'd see these cars going 230 miles an hour, and then on a red flag, they just pull them all into the pits and they shut them off.
Yeah.
And the temperatures of the electronics inside those closely cowled machines just skyrocketed, and one of the cars wouldn't restart because the ECU cooked. So it's a very interesting space, and I love stuff like this, and I've been involved in some aviation live video out of acrobatic airplanes and stuff. It's a very interesting application space. So
actually, Le Mans, it was so cold. I was so paranoid about the heat, and because they were getting to 85 Celsius, I think 180 Fahrenheit. Like, I was so paranoid, and on the day, it was so cold. It was like not an issue, but yeah, it will become an issue in summer or in the Middle East or somewhere, because they like their racing in the Middle East. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.